and welcome to the post-budget 2022 edition of The Nation, where we hope to do an analysis and a roundtable discussion with our panelists and speaker as well. And joining me in this edition as co-host is none other than Daniel Rahman. Daniel, welcome on board. I'm glad you're here with me.
Thank you very much, Jessie, and I'm excited to be here today. And in this edition, we'll be discussing Budget 2022, what's in store for the people, the businesses, as well as the economy as a whole.
Right. So what we know at this point, of course, is that it is the biggest budget ever spent. 332 billion ringgit has been allocated to drive economic recovery. That is, of course, the key word that we're picking up. The government says that it hopes that it will spur economic growth and, of course, improve the well-being of the Keluarga Malaysia. That's the concept, the Malaysian family. But Daniel, growth, apparently, the government hopes will accelerate between 5.5% to 6.5%. What I'm finding out is that some economists are saying, although the budget 2022 seems solid overall, they do have some grouses here and there.
Right. Well, it is an expansionary budget overall, and as we can see from yesterday's tabling of the budget by the finance minister, it was very much focused on the social aspect, looking at taking care of the people and the SMEs. I think the general grouses would be more focused towards what's the bigger picture and what's sort of the long-term trajectory behind Budget 2022, right? How does this help us attract foreign investment, for example? Or what does this mean in the development of talent in the coming years?
That's right. We also know that, the budget is focused on rebuilding businesses in its recovery phase as well, and giving a boost to reforms in the post-pandemic phase. Now, it also hopes to further enhance the implementation of the 12th Malaysia Plan, of course, to drive economic growth in a manner that is more inclusive, that is more sustainable as well. That perhaps for the mid-term or medium term. All this also, Dan, anchored on the SDGs or the Sustainable Development Goals as well as the SPV, which is the Shared Prosperity Vision 2030. So we know we've got the three sort of focus areas, recovery, resilience, and driving reform as well. Overall, I think the budget 2022 takes a whole nation, a whole of nation approach.
Yes, that's right. I totally agree with you. And as we can see, the emphasis on the SDG also tries to ensure that Malaysia is future-proof, which is in line very much with the 12th Malaysia Plan. It also ensures that we do not forget about challenges that are to come, be it things like climate change, be it things like potentially new variants or evolutions of what we've been through. So looking at the past 2 years and the experiences that the people, businesses, and the economy has gone through, Budget 2022 sort of is a continuum of the efforts that the government has started last year in order to protect the people, ensure businesses are resilient, and ensure that the economy continues to grow.
That's right. You said that the keyword there, economy. It's now time to bring in a senior economist with the macroeconomics, trade and investment global practice at the World Bank, Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Finance Hub right here in Kuala Lumpur, to share with us a little bit about her perspective and overview of the budget 2022. Shakira Sharifuddin, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jessie and Daniel, for having me this afternoon. And it certainly is a great pleasure to be here to talk about the budget very briefly. So as we saw yesterday, or what we heard yesterday, obviously the budget covers many, many things. And there's a lot to unpack there. Not enough to do it in 5 to 10 minutes. But what I will do for this briefing is perhaps focus it on three things. First, what are some of the things that we saw that were in line with expectation and some good steps moving forward? Secondly, what were the things or points that were slightly missing, not really aligned with what is intended or insufficient or can be improved going forward? And then finally, to bring it back home and anchor it in fiscal policy, because at the end of the day, that's what is quite important, and see what are some of the fiscal policy measures that were announced and what are the medium-term challenges and follow-up that should come post-budget yesterday. So moving on. So the first thing, what were things that were in line with expectation and some of the good steps that we saw yesterday? I think very noticeably what we saw was there's a greater effort to be more inclusive in this budget. So there was recognition for lagging regions, for example, in Sabah, Sarawak, including in Peninsular Malaysia as well. There is acknowledgement of vulnerable groups such as Orang Asli and the OKUs. And definitely we see a deliberate and bigger emphasis on women, which is very much welcome, particularly in measures such as healthcare, in terms of empowering women, and also some of the measures to alleviate some of the hardship faced by women for this year. So those are very much welcome indeed. And we also know that we also saw yesterday that there's definitely a greater awareness that this is indeed a budget for what is, we think it's going to be a cautiously recovery period into next year. So we still see support given to SMEs, which is very much needed at this time, particularly to the firms that were most affected by the pandemic, and such as those in the tourism sector or the retail sectors. As usual, as per with any budget previously, health and education sectors usually receive the bulk of the budget. And I think this is definitely very much welcome, given that we are still in the pandemic, still uncertain of where the pandemic will take us in the next few months. So definitely a larger allocation in that sectors definitely help, especially in with education, given the learning losses and the school closures. Definitely, it's something that we sort of expected. And then finally, of course, there is an acknowledgement on the need to improve digital infrastructure. So we see it into allocation to Jendela, as well as an explicit focus on climate and environment this particular time. Secondly, what were the things or points that we thought were sort of missing or not really aligned and can be improved going forward? I think first thing that was noticeable to me is in terms of the cash assistance or transfers given. We saw there was it was rebranded to Bantuan Keluarga Malaysia yesterday, and definitely there's some slight decrease in the allocation. But broadly, I think what we at the bank has outlined before is the social safety net in Malaysia in general can be described as it's broad but shallow, in the sense that it covers pretty much those that it needs to reach out. So everybody who needs assistance do get it. But in terms of the depth or the amount received, typically tends to be very small for it to make any impact or significant impact in their lives. So this could be improved better. I think it would think part of the targeting that they used was to bring in household size. But I think going forward, some of the things that can be considered is also in terms of looking at regions. Obviously, cost of living, for example, in Kelantan differs a lot from cost of living in Kuala Lumpur. Yes?
Sure thing. Sure. If I may just jump in there, just talking about social protection for the people, we see under BKM sort of like an expansion of it further from 1,800 last year. This year, families with at least 3 children can up to 2,000, and depending on the configuration, can go up to 2,005. Now, this, some might say, is a step towards notions like universal basic income, but more importantly, it also is about taking care of as many people as possible, and that's further qualified by the fact that they've raised the welfare qualifying criteria from 900 over ringgit to about 1,200 ringgit thereabouts. So, what are your thoughts on this particular aspect of the expansion, especially for the B40 group?
I think this is, like I said, it's a step in the right direction in the sense that it is an attempt to increase the depth or the amount given to those who are in need. But I think, like I said earlier, there needs to be better targeting in terms of who received it, and then targeting in terms of how much received per where you are at, in terms of household size. And I think the bigger issue is, of course, when it comes to social protection here in Malaysia is addressing the fragmentation in the social protection system, because that's one of the bigger impediments in terms of ensuring that there's a smooth delivery of those assistance to those who are in need. And definitely, of course, budget is not the platform to discuss that, but that's definitely something that should be looked into as a complementary measures to some of the announcements.
So speaking of social measures, we see a lot of the government entities getting involved, right? So it's EPF, Perkeso, even a lot of the online platforms who are involved very much in the gig economy is involved in the social protection space. So what do you see as vital in terms of making sure that what was announced yesterday actually works and trickles down and gets gig workers, for example, to sign up to social protection initiatives which were announced yesterday?
Yes. So I think, as I said, alluded before the question earlier, one is, of course, to address the fragmentation in the social protection system. So currently, different types of assistance are administered by different agencies and ministries. So sometimes it creates a lot of transaction costs to the recipients. So that should be addressed. I think one of the bigger challenges that needs to be looked at I think it's a step in the right direction when the government announced, a social insurance scheme or protection scheme for gig workers. And a better option is, of course, to let them to opt out rather than opt in. So everybody is automatically brought in, and then if they want to, opt out, they can do so going forward.
Sh-
I
Right.
I think
Shakira,
yes, Jesse.
if we look at it, many are saying that this is a 2022 budget that is an endemic budget, meaning to say that it will try or attempt to balance healthcare, vaccination, and then at the same time to scale up economic activity. What are some of the key highlights or initiatives that you find particularly interesting, or that the World Bank is rather interested in? As we know, the budget emphasizes on recovery, resilience, and reform. How are you and the World Bank seeing this?
Well, I think one of the, as we saw earlier, I think that the recognition for vulnerable groups is definitely a step in the right direction. And I think what I sort of repeating myself here a bit is that there is definitely an awareness that this is definitely a budget for a recovery period, and therefore the some of the measures given to SMEs are still in place. In fact, I think are being enhanced, which is good because you don't want to sort of wind down some of the measures too soon, and that's definitely something that it's worth noting. I think there were some of the measures that were, I think, well intended, but maybe can be improved in terms of the housing ownership scheme. Some of the measures around tax, those were good measures, but those are small in terms of the impact that it would have on the government's fiscal position. So yes, that's some of the things that sort of like struck me at the very beginning. And so if I can go on a bit here, I think there are some longer term challenges or structural challenges when it comes to the budget yesterday. I think fiscal policy and is something that needs to be sort of discussed deeper. One of the challenges that we saw is that in terms of government revenue is expected to remain low, and I think the estimation is about 14.3% of GDP next year. And in addition, another layer of challenge is the operating expenditure is expected to amount to about 68% of total operating expenditure. And that's quite big. Those are locked in expenditures in terms of salaries, pensions, and debt service payment. So that's a big challenge that government needs to look at. And these are not something to be addressed within 1 year, but something that has to be addressed, or at least thought about right from the very beginning.
Yeah, Shakira, if I may then just jump in here and say that under the 12th Malaysia plan, right, the target is for Malaysia to lower the fiscal deficit to between 3 and 3.5% of GDP by 2025, from the current deficit of about 6.5 to 7% currently. And yesterday, the minister announced that the target for next year is to lower it to 6%. Now, keeping in mind that the budget is expansionary, do you think this is achievable? And what would Malaysia need to do, because we're talking about structural reforms here, in order to achieve these debt deficit targets?
Sure, I think it's a welcome measure that there's no aggressive consolidation plans within the next couple of years, because we're still at, as you pointed out, that we are still in a recovery phase. So consolidating it too big and too soon might sort of take us a step back. I think the challenge is, of course, to look at how we can increase government revenue going forward, really looking into structural measures. So there were some announcements, as we've heard yesterday, for example, small tax on small value items, services tax on goods and delivery services. Those are really good, but in terms of its impact,
tax on companies, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Also tax on what you buy on Shopee from China going forward. So
That's right.
Those are good measures, but obviously in terms of the overall amount, it's not as significant. There is also the windfall tax that was announced yesterday called Cukai Makmur, if you remember.
That's right.
So again, it's a good step, but it's a one-off measure. So it's applicable only for financial year 2022. And of course, like I said, continue to repeat myself, it's a more sustainable or structured measures going forward when it comes to revenue. It is important. And at the same time, it's also not just about collecting more, but also about spending better. And obviously, a few days ago, we read the news about the Auditor General report about spending leakages, which amounted to about 600 million, 620 million. That's one, but also beyond reducing wastage, it's also about spending better. So looking into regressive subsidies, for example, fuel subsidies, those are quite essential as well. So just to give a quick numbers on fuel subsidy, for example. So for each ringgit that the government spent on fuel subsidy, only 4 cents goes into the pocket of those at B40 or B20, and 4 ringgit goes into those in the top income group. So really, it's quite regressive in that nature. So which is why, again, going back to the point, better targeting of subsidies and cash assistance is quite essential as well.
Shakira, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. We didn't realize the time on the clock. We've in fact exceeded the time allocated, but we hope to speak to you again. Thank you for your insights and sharing some of your thoughts. That was Shakira Sharifuddin, a senior economist with the Macroeconomics Trade and Investment Global Practice at the World Bank Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Finance Hub right here in Kuala Lumpur. It's now time to bring on our amazing panel of experts and subject matter experts as well to weigh in a little bit more on Budget 2022. I have with me a set of 3 panelists here. Firstly, joining us, Professor Ulong Dr. RAJAH, Distinguished Professor of Economics at the Asia-Europe Institute of University Malaya, as well as NAJWA, Senior Analyst with the BowerGroupAsia, and ARMAN HUSEIN, Deputy President of Malaysian Relief Agency, MRA Siswa, joining us all the way from New York. Welcome, panelists, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's hit the ground running here. We've got so much to discuss. Overall theme is Keluarga Malaysia Makmur Bersama, the Malaysian family. We should prosper together as well. Perhaps I can go around and get an overview very quickly in summary of how each of you view the latest tabled budget. Arina?
Yeah, thanks. So firstly, I think similarly to what Shakira mentioned earlier, I think it's quite a good budget and trying to be extensive in protecting the most vulnerable. I think we saw a bit of focus on women empowerment. We also saw trying to bridge the urban-rural divide. So I think those are things that we should note and things that should be celebrated. I think some of the things that probably we could improve on and also aligning to the 12th Malaysia Plan, as we talked about earlier, is not just recovery, but really jolting back the economy. I think looking at sectors that really helped the country during the pandemic. If you look at manufacturing sectors, specifically E&E, for example, this is actually what helped Malaysia during the pandemic. We even saw exports, saw during that time. So what is it really then going to help for these sectors? What's going to be done? How do we add to a higher value chain? For Malaysia, if that's what we want to do in the 12th Malaysia Plan. So it is definitely in recovery mode. I don't know if it's going to be something that will jolt Malaysia back in, well performing or, be more in line with the 12th Malaysia Plan. I'm still unsure about that.
Thanks for that. Prof, perhaps you'd like to weigh in a bit with, you've already been warmed up. You've been speaking quite at length about the budget pre and post as well. So in summary, what are some of your key takeaways?
I mean, as with the previous budgets, there's always this keluarga and belanjawan bersemangat. That sort of thing has been around, and I like that part of it. But going through the details, I just wanted to raise 3 points. While I think the budget looks exciting on paper, it's one that targets even the most affected groups, as well as a real attempt to stimulate the economy. I think there are a number of questions that somewhat remain unexplained. Among them is also the way we seem to rely on projections. I mean, I remember last year the budget that Tunku Zafrul announced expected that we will grow by about 6.5%. And he's right to say the World Bank and the IMF had even higher growth rates. And therefore, he was, in that sense, more conservative. And see what happened. Likewise, now we see a deficit falling from 6.5%, which is real, as opposed to what we'll get by the end of the year, 6%, which is not real yet. We're just expecting that. Are we going to hit those numbers? Now, I'd like to, before mentioning those things, I'd like to mention 3 points that I'm somewhat concerned about, but not that the answers are not there. Perhaps we need to look at the details to get to understand this. The first is the way inclusivity is defined. For some reason, the word inclusive really refers to engaging the vulnerable groups. And now, if I looked at it, the townhouse that we have doesn't really bring the real seriously vulnerable groups. Likewise, it tends to bring people like from FMM. They are not part of that. And we tend to use indicators that denote, that reflect on those vulnerable groups rather than engaging them. Remember this statement, the source of that inclusivity feelings that are real for those observing it are not the same as for those who are feeling it. What more for policymakers who don't even see or feel that feeling of a vulnerable group? So I think that there needs to be more engagement by the examples that Madam Shakira mentioned just now about vulnerable groups like Orang Asli and so on and so forth. The second one is, I think, have we detailed the 4 categories of people in B40? 4 categories. Even so, in 2020, Datuk Mustafa Muhammad's time, we already have, it is still around, the poverty line income has been changed to 2028. Now suddenly we go back to the 1919 figure that was criticized by the UN guy. So what are we doing there? And there's 4 categories. How are we pitching our fiscal instruments against that group? Now, another point I'd like to mention here is about greening. It's nice to say by 2050 we will have a carbon neutral environment. Now, of course, for a while we were heading in that direction to meet at least something like 25% renewable energy by 2025. I think we need to go back to that sort of detail to see whether we are actually meeting those kinds of things in relation to that. So my own take, I don't want to take that much of time since I'm sure the young ones that will have a lot to say. Arman, yes.
Go ahead, Arman. What are your thoughts?
Thank you. Thank you. So as Jesse summarized, the budget is structured around 3 main themes: recovery, resilience, and reform. But then, as Madam Shakir already mentioned, we're in the recovery period. So in general, I think we can all agree that a lot of the initiatives that the government has in store for us are mainly focused on the recovery aspect out of the 3. So is there enough resilience and reform initiatives? That is something that we have to ponder. And for me personally, I think it's a very interesting question to ask ourselves, because in the US, there's a lot of buzz around Biden's Build Back Better Act, which is essentially a 1.7 trillion COVID-19 relief budget involving future economic and infrastructure package that's very comprehensive. It covers everything from increasing affordable healthcare coverage and also addressing serious climate change issues. So you can really see the parallel between what's happening halfway across the world in the US and what's happening in Malaysia. And for me, it raises the question of whether the government could have done more to ensure that we can jolt back the economy, not only to the pre-pandemic level, but the level that's much higher than that, the level that we want to aspire to be at after COVID. And I think as an aspirational young man, I am pretty optimistic. I feel like we should see the pandemic not just as an obstacle to overcome, but as an opportunity to really reset and re-strategize so that we can bounce back to a level that's higher than ever. But seeing the budget as it was tabled yesterday, it was really a turn-off for me because I expected more. But then again, if we were to be more realistic, I think the government is doing the best that it can. And the budget as it is very comprehensive and tackle a lot of issues that concern the youth, such as environmental preservation, cultural preservation, as well as aligning government finances with the SDGs. So there's a lot to unpack there, which I'm sure we'll get into later in this discussion. So I'm excited for that.
You're absolutely right, Arman. There's a lot to unpack. So what we'd probably do now is to look at the 3 focus areas that that was tabled yesterday, which is Rakyat's well-being, resilient businesses, as well as prosperous and sustainable economy. And we'll come back to some of those points that you highlighted about sort of what's happening overseas, Prof. Rajah's greening point, as well as the ideas of projection. But I want to go into first on the recovery for livelihoods and livelihood strategy. So, under the Bantuan Keluarga Malaysia, 8.2 billion ringgit in direct financial cash injections was announced, with families getting up to 2,000. So I asked this earlier to Shakira. So what are your thoughts? What are the panel's thoughts on this allocation that was given? And would this not be seen as a move towards greater universal basic income or universal basic assets, especially when it comes to protecting the B40? Any of the members of the panel, maybe?
But we already have a definition of poverty line that goes back from what we actually chose to do, that is turning it into 2028 ringgit as the poverty line income. Now we're going back to something like 1,900 or close to 2,000.
Yeah, this is a bit lower, Dato'. It's about 1,002. But like, I see your point. That's going to expand the number of welfare recipients by about 400,000. But don't you think by raising it up to...
The point I'm trying to make is, it also is something where the budget to me appears like it's quite detached from what we've been doing all this while. I would have preferred to see a profound review of the previous budget, if not for the earlier budgets, and then to see why, if at all, we didn't meet those targets there, what went wrong, so that we will be able to unpack in ways where you look at institutional matters, which we can easily address in the course of the next budget. Now that seems to be, it's just like if we're talking about technology, for example, we have science parks, we have incubators, we have all sorts of knowledge nodes like universities, public labs, and so on. We introduce smart schools, but how are they connected? Are they connecting connectivity and coordination to ensure that there's economic synergies emerging from them? That would require that we go back and focus on that rather than just discussing about the many different things that they're going to do, which look exciting though, about broadband infrastructure, about giving opportunities for robots and drones, including addressing the problems of connecting firms like Aerodyne, which was Tengku Darfur mentioned the other day. So my point is really linked to those kinds of issues. Are we immersed in the way Malaysia has evolved structurally? Otherwise, we'll go back to the time when the Way Forward was launched in 1991 by Tun Mahathir, and then we suddenly talk about various different things that we're going to somewhat unconnected, so much so that all these structures that we created, which are to me important, because
yeah, I guess, Prof, it goes back to the end of the day to how it does affect the reasonable man, and how it affects our lives and livelihoods as well. When we talk about focus one, the focus area one, it mainly, of course, focuses on the rakyat's well-being. And then
I have no problem with that. They're nice though. Nice to hear that. Yes, they're important.
Yeah, they've got perhaps a look at mental health, and also, of course, at the vaccination, education, employment, job creation, sports and youth. And I just wanted to, of course, women empowerment as well. I just wanted to zoom in a little bit at this point in terms of, cost of living. Of course, we look at a budget. How is it going to enhance my life? How am I going to be able to have more dollars and cents in my pocket? As we know, unprecedented times, we've all taken a hit at some point or another. Let's look at the employment and job creation section under the focus area one. Under Jamin Kerja, the government aims to prepare 600,000 jobs and have allocated 4.8 billion ringgit. What are some of the panelists' thoughts around this as well? Given that unemployment rate as of August this year was at 4.6%, and of course the aim is to reduce the unemployment rate at this point. Is that achievable? Arman, perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts.
For sure. I find a lot of the initiatives surrounding job creation and tackling unemployment very comforting, because as a third-year economics student who will probably, inshallah, graduate next year, I am very worried about my future. I don't know what's going to happen once I graduate because the job market is very uncertain. So it is comforting to know that the government is taking steps to ensure that our graduates have stuff to do after graduating, right? For me, the way I see my future, and I have a few options. Number one is to get a job. And there are initiatives under the Malaysian Budget 2022, like Portasia and MyStep, the short-term employment program, where the government allocates 1.8 billion ringgit to place up to 80,000 graduates in different GLCs and government agencies. A second option that I think a lot of future graduates should consider is TVET. So maybe they can pivot a bit or start early and consider TVET as a career option. The government is allocating 6.6 billion through the Perkasa TVET initiative. The third option is to shift your mindset from becoming a job seeker to job creator. And through the different matching grants scheme, I'm sure students could start seeing themselves as future entrepreneurs and start their own companies or businesses so that they can be self-employed and employ others instead of trying to find jobs, which is a very tall order by today's standards. And the fourth one is to continue with higher studies so as to compensate for a lot of the learning losses and wait until the job market starts to boom again before you join the job market, right? So it is comforting to know that the government recognizes the problems that we have with the labor market right now, And as a student, these are the options that I have on the table that the budget 2022 presents me with. So yeah, it is a step in the right direction, but there are parts where I think some tweaking needs to be done, particularly in terms of providing more scholarships for those who are considering furthering their studies before joining the job market. But yeah, we're making we're heading in the right direction in terms of trying to match graduates with jobs.
Yeah, thanks Arman for those thoughts. And I think with job searching and job seeking, there obviously comes a certain pressure that's associated with it, especially when a lot of factors are out of our control due to market volatility, global economy, etc., etc. But I would like to sort of focus a little bit more on the mental health aspect now. So, Arina, the Ministry of Health this year has the second largest budget. And that's something that a lot of people have been asking for, of which 70 million ringgit has been allocated. I believe that's a little bit more than double what was announced last year for mental health support, training, and initiatives. Could you share your thoughts on where you see this heading, and might even be an indication that more people are having mental health challenges in Malaysia?
Yep, for sure. I think I'll touch upon that on two levels. I think the first is just talk specifically about mental health. I think for sure the statistics have shown that mental health has become an increasing issue. We've seen suicide rates increase as well. And that's quite troubling. So in this instance, I think that's a good step. I think in addition to budget, and I think going back to also some of the previous points that were mentioned, is there needs to be some alignment, right? Okay, you can increase your budget, but are the systems in place that people are open and able to go and seek mental health assistance? If I go to the hospital, who is going to treat me? Are there enough therapists? Are there enough counselors? Will I be pushed away? Because we also know that there is a stigma around mental health. Sometimes it's associated with religion. So budget is there, that's great, but is it targeted in the right areas? Same thing goes, I think, for jobs, right? Great that you have all this budget for jobs, but cost of living, as Jessie pointed out, is still quite expensive. So is that money enough? Number two, are we creating or channeling the money into the right sectors, right? Or is it just going to be into very low value added sectors instead of high value added sectors which the government intended, right? If we're not innovating in the kinds of sectors like in STEM, for example, that the government intended, then the budget or the money being spent is not being channeled in the right area. So I think it needs to be some alignment, and whether or not that's going to achieve the overall goal that Malaysia wants to see itself in the next 5 years, for example. I think so that's on one part. The second part, if I'll just quickly go on to, is on healthcare. I mean, it's great. It's the second largest budget, but if we compare it to the previous year, it was only about a 1.5 or under 2% increase, which is quite surprising, right? Because you would think that during COVID, it would be a larger chunk would be given into the healthcare sector. But it's still, in this instance, it's still not very closer to what the ideal of how much percentage per GDP that healthcare should be spent on for a middle income country or upper middle income country like Malaysia. I think last year it was about 2+% per GDP out of our GDP we spent on public healthcare. The ideal is about close to 4%. So are we heading towards that? So it's not just giving the money, but is it really utilizing that money in the right areas? Yeah, sorry, Daniel, go ahead.
Oh, Jessie, would you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to, in fact, swiftly move into the fact that, there are so many elements to consider here. But because we're speaking to two of our youth joining us, I wanted to sort of, get into this youth and sports segment as well. And as you've mentioned as well, we're coming out of this pandemic, you would think that certain budgets would be, more allocated in terms of healthcare and provisions that way. So let's move into healthy lifestyles, right? As we move out of this pandemic as well, considering that we need to keep ourselves safe. The government has imposed a duty on sugar drink products. And at the same time, on the back of that, there's also been huge reductions in the allocation for sports, youth and sports budget. Prof, perhaps you'd like to also help jump in and help to reconcile with this. What's going on here?
Sports seem to have become, even though I still exercise, I was a sportsman before, not so much of importance to me in a budget, but it seems imposing that question to me. Let me address that. The BN government already started to tax sugar and so on. And the argument they already made earlier that it's bad for health. And this is just a continuation of that. Now, we're talking about other measure allocations that are put up there for, I have no problems with it. They are all good things to do, but they need to be synchronized. I think they are good measures to have. they need to be synchronized with whether we have the sort of facilities for them to appropriate the synergies from them. So I think those will be my areas of concern. Not that they don't exist, but I know in many areas the way housing estates are done now, unlike the type that I was used to much earlier, you don't really have that much of recreational centers in all these housing estates.
Arina or Arman, do you have any points to jump in there? I think more in terms of the budget that's been allocated for youth and sports.
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's interesting. You're right that the allocation is slightly smaller. There seems to be a focus on esports. So I think you can see the direction that the government is going to in terms of like what kind of sports they're looking into, but still unclear about what's going to happen with the existing programs. Are they going to develop it further? What are the priorities on that? I think if you look at the budget for sports, I think that quite a huge chunk of it is a lot to do with, maintenance, upgrading, facilities, stadiums, and all these things, which is understandable. But going back to the idea of a healthy lifestyle, I think that's an interesting point, especially when you coincide it with, the suddenly an excise duty on vaping, for example, right? And a lot of health groups were quite upset that was still allowed. And so what does that mean for healthcare? But looking back at the healthcare budget, however, about 200 million ringgit was increased for areas of disease control, so health education, promotion, things like non-communicable diseases like cancer. So there is some effort to try and improve in that area, but that, like we mentioned and discussed earlier, the alignment and synchronization seems to be quite unclear at this stage.
So can I just have an interjection here, because I think it's important. While those things are really important, but it's important to note that, do we have a system that is foolproof? It's just like you increase taxes on alcohol, that's good. But it leads to counterfeit alcohol. If you increase taxes on cigarettes, counterfeit cigarettes, all of which are far more dangerous than what they have here. Now, I have been in panels talking to the CEOs of these companies. If we are going to have that sort of problems, then it doesn't really help to tax that much more, because people will think that there's enough grease to pay off for all these security guys, those guys who are supposed to protect against that. And at the same time, much of the sales will be from all these counterfeit guys from whom the government will not get any taxes.
Yeah. The government did last year, Professor, announce enhancement of enforcement as efforts, right? This includes, taking into cognizance the fact that 30 billion ringgit is the size of the shadow economy, which is rather sizable. Have you, from your experience, have you seen efforts to enhance enforcement and to sort of cut out the temptations, the greasing temptations, actually work or come into fruition? Or if not so, what did the government need to do? Maybe announce more money for enforcement?
That's the sort of thing I feel we seem to hear lots of giveaways. I'm not sure if they are actually going to ensure that we will get our desired results. Now, you could do that where you have strong enforcement, like in Singapore, you could do that. But I think we've had serious leakage here. And I think that sort of focus must be really, really strong. And that, talking to those guys who are running these companies, chairmen and so on, they say that too much has happened on the ground.
As we speak of allocations and losses as well, I think it's also important to note that in Focus Area 1, the Ministry of Education has received the biggest allocation. That's 52.6 billion ringgit out of the total budget. Arman, before we got on this call, you had shared some of your views on the fact that, or rather on the impact of COVID-19 on education. Do you feel that this amount of 52.6 billion is in fact enough to cover up or make up for issues like learning losses?
I can't say for sure. There is an increase in budget allocated for the Ministry of Education, but I can also attest to the fact that the effects of COVID-19 on students has been very, very profound. In many ways, they are irreversible. In other ways, they can be mitigated or reduced. So I'm not that optimistic that 52.6 billion ringgit would do the wonders that we expect them to do. But let's just talk a little bit more about how another dimension to healthcare and learning, healthcare especially, is seeing education and in its institutions as a proxy for a healthy life, especially among members of academia and students in Malaysia. because when COVID hit, a lot of students lost access to their schools and the facilities that they have to offer. So that probably meant they lost access to school lunch programs and maybe some physical activities that are mandated through the national curriculum. As such, we can probably extrapolate the fact that some of the decline in well-being of these students can stem from the fact that they didn't attend school for how many years? Probably 1.5 years. So how do we reverse the damage? Some of the budget that has been allocated to other ministries, like for example, the 15 million ringgit allocated to the Youth and Sports Ministry for the Agenda Nasional Malaysia Sihat, hopefully we can steal some of that money and use that to, affect the students more positively so that we can reverse this decline in well-being, whether it's physical or mental. And speaking of learning losses and the effects of online learning, right? Just to share some statistics, out of 9 million children in Malaysia many years ago, 424,000 of them were found to be affected by various mental health problems. And when the pandemic hit, this number was expected to grow to double or triple because of different circumstances in their respective households. They may come from abusive households or from unstable ones economically or socially, right? So I think it's very important that some of the budget allocated for the Ministry of Education is used to train and upskill teachers or members of the academic community in general so that they can detect whatever's going on with the students when they come back to class. I think they've already, schools in Malaysia have already reopened, so I think they're already attending schools now. So if teachers are not trained in assessing the mental wellness of their students, I think now is a good time to do that.
Right. So I think, thanks for your thoughts, Arman, and it shows that the ministry does continue to invest heavily, but I suppose the point you're
Daniel,
making...
can I have just an interjection on that?
Sure thing.
I think it's raised some important points. If you look at our performance, we've had high allocations for education until about 2012. Then it's declined, then suddenly it's gone up now. That's good. I think part of the reason why it was slashed is because of the concern for fiscal discipline and so on, taking the line of people like Rogoski, Reinhardt, Raghuram, or even the finance minister of England, Sunak. Now, my concern with that is just this. When you look at performance in schools, TIMSS and PISA, for example, we perform far worse than those kids from Vietnam. Those figures are already out. I mean, I have a book which I edited. I didn't write that chapter. Malaysia's Leap into the Future, the building blocks. Those details are there. I think we need to see what's going wrong. We need to look at how these things could be improved. If we raise it to 52.6 billion, and for the higher education ministry, we have 14.5 billion. Now we need to also see that it's going to the right sort of purposes. Are we training the teachers to be really good so that their competence will be reflected in the students?
Yeah, I definitely hear your point, Professor, because we've invested a lot. Yet I think it's about the outcome and the outcomes from these investments, especially in our children and in the long run. I'd like to move on very quickly though to the next topic, because we talk about children. Then another aspect that was also very much emphasized on was women empowerment. Now, it is heartening to see that the Ministry of Finance spoke at length about the vital role played by women in the development and the growth of the country, socially on top of economically as well, right? Various things were announced, for example, grants, microfinancing grants, the ability to work from home, improving government childcare facilities, additional funding for the Royal Malaysian Police Force, as well as free basic sanitary kits for 130,000 B40 teenagers. Now, Arina, what are your thoughts on this emphasis of women empowerment, which I don't think we've seen in budgets of years past?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one, and it was obviously welcomed. I think on one aspect, it's really good to go and show that, women in the workforce returning and the incentives to encourage more women in the workforce. As we see, there's still a lot of cultural norms that women have to stay at home and take care of the family. I think that was quite evident during the pandemic, where a lot of women had to be, step out of the workforce to take care of their families. And I think in these areas, I think that's great. I hope that this also translates to single mothers, for example. and their ability to also work and also contribute to their family. But again, I think, taking, and also for the health kits, I think that's great. I personally would prefer if the health kits were given to all women, and I hope it's just not a one-off, because we do get our menstruation every month. So I hope it's a continuous policy. But I think looking at the ecosystem as well, I think there's also still some areas need to be done in terms of sexual harassment. So I think the sexual harassment bill could also be pushed further to complement the more gender responsive budget, I would say. So I think it is a step in the right direction. But obviously more can be done. But I think it's still a good move, and that acknowledgement, I think, is a signal to the rest of society that women are important and have always been important, contributing, half or making up half of the population of the country.
Right.
As we talk about empowerment, also one of the big lessons throughout this past 18 months or so is the fact that we need to be resilient, whether on the home front and especially on the professional or business front as well. And that brings us to the focus area 2, of which budget 2022 entails as well. A few different areas here to address, from technology to investments, and of course looking at the role of GLCs and how do we help some of the very badly hit sectors, for example, to bounce back or recover. Let's look at perhaps firstly tech and startups. Prof, maybe you'd like to weigh in there as well. As we are futuristic, I still come back to your 3 grouses that you had, your main 3 points that you shared with us initially, and you say that structural reforms still need to happen as well. But as we look forward, what are some of your thoughts around the allocations with technology as back end and to support more startups?
Thank you, Jessie. But please allow me to add a line to what Arina mentioned. Actually, in my understanding, the focus on SMEs and women grew strong with Tun Badawi's administration. It's been there from then on. So we just hope that it really institutionalized and it happens. Now, coming back to the technology part of it, I think that you can easily measure in relation to whether you're measuring the immediate output of innovation. We actually have a rise in publications. That's because for a while we were funding a lot of universities to engage in research and of course, to publish scientific articles. But what they have not done in any substantive way is whether they have been able to take patents in the US the way Korea and Taiwan has done. And more importantly, whether their innovations have hit the market, whether they've been able to commercialize that. That part of it, we are still weak, but we are not that much worse than Singapore in that sort of sense. But my own feeling is that's where I felt there's a lot of initiatives to fund various different components of the digitalization process, whether it's big data analytics, cloud control, cloud computing, whole range of things Tunku Zarful announced. But let's go to something more minor, because the science and technology parks that I talked about, they are key in supporting small firms. They are really key in supporting small firms because they are the ones that basically give them the opportunity to appropriate frontier knowledge that labs and so on provide. When small firms or farms connect to that sort of knowledge nodes, they are able to participate at that sort of level. Because they're too small to invest, even though we have 40 billion going to Scheme Smara, for example, all that we have. So my own feeling is, if there is a focus on making sure there's enough oil to see that connections are there and coordination are there, small farmers can obviously, and here it requires, rather than giving individuals, collective efficiency is necessary, because one small farmer cannot possibly appropriate economies of scale from using a robot. So it would mean that they need to address those kinds of things too, so that they can have collectively intensive farming to address, for example, a deficit we're facing in food production. Something Tunku Zarful also mentioned yesterday's budget.
Right. Thank you, Professor. Talking about collective impact by various entities working together, public-private partnerships, government, NGO, this quadruple helix was often emphasized in different ways during the budget tabling. I'd like to move a little bit on to the role of GLCs. So we see last year the GLCs played a role in the distribution of 150,000 laptops to school students. This year, or so next year, the GLCs are expected to continue to play a significant role. Just to kind of share some of the things announced yesterday, this is 5 billion to empower MSME entrepreneurs, a CSR initiative amounting to RM500 million for medical devices and scholarships, and job opportunities via MyStep. Now, to the panelists, what are your thoughts on GLCs playing such an active role in national development in this regard?
If I may just add, yeah,
sure.
I think for GLCs, I think it's great, obviously, that they play a role. But I think another question that could be asked is also, is that a healthy dependency on our GLCs? I think alluding back to also what Shakira talked about earlier is increasing our revenue. So, if I were just to pivot a little bit in terms of, getting foreign direct investment into the country, and this also will tie into education, for example. If you're looking towards ASEAN, Malaysia is probably one of the lowest recipients of foreign direct investment. We're behind Singapore, Indonesia, and also Vietnam. So I think, although the GLC contribution is great, but I don't think we can rely on them for a very long time. Even GLCs on its own as an institution would definitely need some reforms. But here the question then, if you tie it into things like education, right, and that's also what's going to contribute to more investors coming in and being more interested, things like STEM, right? If we look at certain sectors, like the E&E, they were a major contributor to total exports last year. How can we increase that? Then maybe diversify some of the revenue and income coming into the country so that we don't have to rely too much on GLCs.
Can I just add on here?
Sure, Prof, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, by technical definition, if you juxtapose macroeconomics and microeconomics, if you're dealing with MMSEs, we are actually talking about micro, medium, small enterprises. Now, they are really firms that would rely on economies of scale, a scope rather than economies of scale. And the GLCs are dinosaurs, they're all that big. Now, in what sort of sense can they be good role models for the small firms, which is one of the reasons why the chaebols have not really successfully developed small firms in South Korea, as opposed to what you see in Taiwan. So my own feeling is, unless they're funding experts from that sort of a background to come on to help the SMEs, which somewhat would look detached in some sort of ways, I'm not sure whether that will be helpful to. I think Jesse is out to.
That's right. I'm a timekeeper here as well, but also want to really touch on all the points that we had summarized to highlight and address today. As I take all of our panelists swiftly into the final key area, and that is the focus area 3, Paris and sustainable economy in terms of creating reforms. I know very quickly that we don't have much time on the clock, so I'll just need all the panelists to really jump in here. Very recently, just a couple of days ago, in fact, it was said, the Prime Minister said that he wants to revive the Made in Malaysia brand again. Will the budget be able to make Malaysia regionally competitive? Prof, and perhaps Arman and Arina, you'd like to very quickly weigh in from your own personal perspective as well.
My position is it's okay to start, because in the end, development is about building national capabilities. Taiwan and Korea did that by focusing on local firms, national firms. We went on launching those programs after the Lucas policy in 1981, but I don't think we took the right sort of steps. If they are capable of bringing back the ability, something they didn't enjoy before, in making sure that we make the transition so that firms catch up, national firms catch up and leapfrog against incumbents the way Korean and Taiwanese firms have done, then that's fine. But they haven't demonstrated the capability, though, so far.
That's right. Arman, your thoughts?
Yeah,
and perhaps
for sure,
in summary of the budget as well, from your perspective.
I guess I can speak more on what the NGOs are doing and how perhaps we can play a part in this larger agenda of promoting Malaysian-made products. I'm just going to start by prefacing that it's good that the government is trying to create a very healthy relationship with NGOs by allocating, I think it was around RM100 million matching grant for NGOs for areas like mental health, animal welfare, social entrepreneurship, online education, environmental and cultural conservation. But I think what's missing here is there needs to be an impetus for NGOs to transform themselves into social enterprises so that they're less reliant on the government. And I think social enterprises, they do have the capacity to create products that's very Malaysian in nature, using like local resources and local expertise. And by developing that niche, I think that's one of the ways that NGOs or social enterprises rather can help us create this very unique products that can make us very competitive when marketing the goods that are produced in Malaysia.
Thanks, Arman. Arina?
Yeah, I think I'll just say that I think for this effort it needs to be targeted rather than just giving money for everybody. Really look at what Malaysia is good at, what it can do, what are the resources that we have, and really channeling into those areas to make the Made in Malaysia brand like quite effective.
That's right. I think some of the bigger questions as well, as we've
Can
discussed.
I just add one more point, Jessie? Sorry.
Yes, Prof.
I think we should have introduced, and if we had not done it before, we should do it now, an appraisal mechanism where there's stringent selection, monitoring, and subsequent reappraisal, so that those who are getting rents through either grants or incentives are required to meet certain standards, meaning export quotas or an upgrading in technology. Otherwise, you should withdraw them. These rents will be dissipated otherwise.
That's right. Well, I guess also the bigger question here is how do we ensure the budget will not just be another exercise, but one that will promise to deliver? So, instead of just theory, how will this also work in terms of delivery on the ground as well? Panelists, thank you very much for your time and your insights as well. So now we'll have to wait and see how this government pans this budget out and how it will trickle down to the ground. Dan?
Yep. No, thank you very much. And the panelists, great insights. I know a lot to talk about, maybe in the future session. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And Jessie.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
We'll see you next time.